Today, I'd like to say thank you to Martha White for agreeing to be interviewed by the Friend Memorial Public Library in Brooklyn. Martha White is a writer and editor and granddaughter of E.B. White. Recently, she won a prestigious award for E.B. White on Democracy from the Maine Literary Award. It was for Best Anthology. So congratulations, Martha.
Thank you. Thank you. Maine Writers and Publishers is a great organization for writers and readers in the state of Maine, and we've had a nice history with them.
So when did you start writing?
Oh, I don't even remember when I started writing when I was a child. I was always writing stories as a child. I mean, I started writing as for work, probably in college. I mean, I was an English major in high school and college, and always had the idea that some way or another I would make my living with reading or writing books, and was fortunate to be able to do that. The funny thing to me now is when I first started making my living as a writer, I never used to tell anybody that E.B. White was my grandfather, because I never wanted of course I was very proud of him, but I never wanted anybody to take me as on his literary merits. I wanted to be sure that I was earning my own way. So it was this big secret, and if anybody knew me and knew that about me, I would be careful to say, you mustn't mention that, don't say anything about that. And so for years, I mean, first I was doing book reviews and working for small newspapers, and then I was working in an office writing newsletters for businesses and so forth. And then slowly I made my way into freelancing and was successful enough to leave my day job and make my way as a writer. And still, I didn't tell people that I was E.B. White's granddaughter. I worked for Yankee Magazine for 17 years, and only a few people there even knew. And that was fine. That was a good way to start off. I worked for the Old Farmer's Almanac very happily for many years. And it wasn't until my grandfather died, and first my father took over his literary estate and managed his permissions and so forth. And then my mother did for a while. And eventually they said, it's your turn, you need to take this on. And so at the point at which I became the literary executor and was working with it's called White Literary LLC, doing the permissions and promoting his books and so forth. At that point, I had to tell people who I was. And one of the first things I did, the letters of E.B. White had just gone out of print. And that was a book of his letters that he and my grandmother had worked with their goddaughter, Dottie Guth, to put together in the 70s. And it had just gone out of print when I started working with his literary estate. And so I thought, well, here's a good way to read through all of his stuff again and revisit the letters book and also add the last 10 years of letters, because the first letters book came out, I think, in 1976, and he died in 1985. So there were almost another decade of letters that could have gone into that book. So that was my first project. It's the revised version of Letters of E.B. White, and that allowed me to reread everything, go through the letters, all of the correspondence. I went out to Cornell University and went through their terrific archive where all of his manuscripts and so forth are on the shelves down like 4 stories underground in the rare books division of the library. And that was a terrific way to start. I mean, that really gave me the opportunity to dig deep into everything he'd written. And the books on his shelf and the letters and correspondence that he'd kept. He kept copies of everything. Fortunately for me, he made my job very easy. And it was fun, to go back through those letters. I mean, the archive at the Cornell University included, letters from me when I was 6, or letters from my brothers, or letters, between my grandparents and my father. I mean, many family letters, as well as, some of the literary greats, John Updike and all kinds of people that he corresponded with, James Thurber, and, all the New Yorker bigwigs. So that was really fun and a great way to start. So we did the letters book, and out of that book came an invitation from the Cornell University Press to put together a book of quotations of E.B. White. And so they were actually going to do a series of books. One was on Frederick Douglass. I think that was supposed to be the first one. And then the E.B. White, and there have been others since, but we put together, in the words of E.B. White, it turned out to be the first in this series of quotation books, because I think the Frederick Douglass author wasn't quite ready to get the manuscript together. And the quotations was a pretty easy book for me to put together, having just gone through everything that he'd written. So we did the quotations book, and that was terrific. And in putting together, in the words of E.B. White, we did it chronologically, and we did it alphabetically by subject matter. So there were all these alphabetical headings, and one of the headings was dogs. And there were so many terrific pieces and quotes about dogs that I just put them in a file folder. And I thought, well, I'll come back to these. I was a dog lover myself, and he'd always had dogs, and I remembered many of them. And I thought, I'll just come back to these and, pick the best ones after I've done everything else. Well, the file folder got huge, and there were so many great pieces, a lot of pieces, of course, about dachshunds and Fred and all the antics of the dachshunds, but others as well. And so in doing the quotations book for Cornell University publishers, it became clear that there was another whole book about dogs, and that it would be really fun to do it. And so after the quotations book got off the ground, I went and saw Jennifer Bunting, who was then the publisher of Tilbury Press here in Maine. It was at that time in Gardner, Maine. And Jennifer she used to live and work in Brooklyn. She was a wooden boat employee for a while, and she also was a Sunday office help for my grandparents for a while. So she knew them, she knew the farm, and she also loved dogs. And so I went to Jennifer and I said, I've got all these great dog pieces and quotations. Don't you think it would be fun to do E.B. White on dogs? And it took about 5 minutes of conversation. She said, yes, let's do it. And so very quickly we put together E.B. White on dogs. And that was really fun. I mean, it was just, humorous and funny, and everybody loved the pieces, of course, about the dachshunds and Fred. But there were just many, many very lighthearted pieces in it. And it really was kind of a nice showcase of E.B. White. And I've always thought, many, many people only know E.B. White for the children's books. They know Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and Trumpet of the Swan. And I always thought, well, E.B. White on dogs is going to be the book that will transition all those kids, from the children's books to his adult pieces, because it was so funny and so easily, readable and likable, that I thought that here's one, to bring all of those young readers into the adult world of E.B. White. So that was great, and we the dog and pony show, so to speak, no pun intended, for the dog book went on and on. I mean, there were just so many libraries and bookstores and pet shops and places that wanted to hear about the dog book, that we just kept going with the public readings and so forth. And that was really fun, and it kind of nicely transitioned also into becoming a nice fundraiser for a lot of the pet shops and care centers for dogs that needed to be adopted and so forth, which my grandfather would have loved. The idea that he was also helping. All of his dogs were mongrels. He never he never had a pedigree dog, I don't think, in his life, and so he would have loved it, the idea that a few more dogs maybe were saved thanks to Fred and in his works. So that was fun. And at the end of the dog book, I thought, okay, I'm really done. It's not my normal mode to be up in front of people or doing, these Zoom calls. Or, I'm much like my grandfather, much happier to just be in my office alone. And kind of keeping my own company. So I thought, all right, I'm done, and now we can just go about the business of keeping his books on the shelf. And then the election came along in 2016, and there was so much turmoil and so much divisiveness and so much news about what was going on with the state of our democracy and so forth. And at first, I just kept writing letters to the editor. I'd hear about something in the news to do with, nationalism or fascism or the demise of democracy or something. And I'd shoot off a letter to the editor about it. And often I would find myself wanting to quote something that he had written about democracy or fascism or nationalism or presidents who play golf. It was uncanny how timely so many of his pieces were. And in the late 30s, early 40s, he'd put together a book called The Wild Flag, which almost nobody knows. It's pretty rare and been out of print for a long time now. But The Wild Flag had a whole series of essays on the subject of democracy, and so many of those seemed so pertinent that I thought, okay, maybe we need to do one more book. And so I proposed the idea to HarperCollins, which is Harper's has been his publisher for all the whole ride. And they said, yes, absolutely, we need to do this book, and we need to do it fast. So very quickly, we put together E.B. White on Democracy, and that's been an interesting ride. It's been well received, but to a small audience, I would say, certainly compared to the dog book, but recently picked up by China to be reprinted in China with a different title. As maybe you have heard, the title here is E.B. White on Democracy. In China, they're going to call it E.B. White on Hope. This is the proof version of it. I don't even have the hardback in front of me. But the E.B. White on Hope came from the one of the essays in the book is a letter. It's actually a letter to Mr. Nadeau, and it's often been called a letter on hope because it's about winding the clock and looking forward to the next day as a better day and not losing hope. It was a letter Mr. Nadeau had written my grandfather during the Vietnam War, and basically said, how do you not lose faith in these dark times? And my grandfather had written him a beautiful short letter about winding the clock. And so that's where the title is coming from for the China version of E.B. White on Democracy. So in a long nutshell, that's the story of the books that I've edited for him to keep his books on the shelves.
That's exciting news about China publishing.
Yes, it was a long time coming. They showed interest, I would say, almost a year ago, and then it kind of went quiet for a while. And I'm not sure if it was because of the tariff situation or exactly why, but just a couple of weeks ago, they decided, yes, they were going to do it. And so now that we've just signed the contract on that. Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite children's book that your grandfather wrote?
Sure. My favorite, uncommonly maybe, is Stuart Little. Everybody always says Charlotte's Web, or most people will say Charlotte's Web. It's rare. Somebody might say Trumpet of the Swan. My personal favorite has always been Stuart Little. partly because I always liked miniatures. You know, when I was a child, I read, The Borrowers, and I would read anything about something in miniature, and the idea of this small mouse child just seemed right to me. Plus, it's got that terrific chapter about sailing, and which was so dramatic. And of course, my family were all into boatyards and boats, so that if I'm asked to read something out of Stuart Little, I usually read the sailing chapter. But I love the chapter in the schoolroom where Stuart is pretending to be the teacher for a day. He's being substitute teacher for a day. And actually, some part of that I quoted in the Democracy book, because he's teaching the children about how there ought to be a chairman of the world, or basically he's making an argument for a world government and how we need to think more globally. There it was in Stuart Little all along. So I've kind of come full circle, I think, from that scene in Stuart Little to the On Democracy book. But that's my favorite. And of course, this is the year there's a big celebration for Stuart Little's 75th. And I think this year is Trumpet of the Swan's 50th, something like that. So Trumpet of the Swan will probably have an anniversary too, I think.
That's exciting. And how special that it's 75 years ago that book was written, and how relevant it is now, a lot of the things that were mentioned. And
oh yeah, absolutely. All three of his children's books actually have a little piece in them about freedom or democracy, or there's a scene in Charlotte's Web where the pig escapes, and the geese are talking to the pig, through the gate, and telling the pig to, prize his freedom, and run and jump, and stay outside the fence. And the Trumpet of the Swan also has its own piece about the value of liberty and so forth. So it's in, my grandfather was never one to write down to children. I think he treated children as if they, were smart and able to field any big word that he might throw out there. And he had a lot of respect for children. And so, of course, he wrote about the things that mattered to him in those children's books, and certainly freedom and democracy and liberty. All of those things are right in there if you look at them. Not because he was trying to teach them anything, but just because it was something he cared about. So,
well, I really appreciate that you've shared this with us, and that you're doing the work that you do to share with everyone who will pick up a book and read about his words and your words. And I'm really thankful that you are doing the work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you. I'm thankful for the Brooklyn Friend Memorial Library. It's always been a favorite place of ours. And of course, my grandmother was very fond of the library and always tried to participate in useful ways. And I have fond memories of it from when I was in school in town. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, and when you're in Brooklyn next, you must check out the fairy houses in the garden that Marge Wilson made. I think because you like little things.
Yes, I will bring my own granddaughter, and we will do that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I really, I hope you have a wonderful time on your next project. And I'd love to hear about what you're doing next.
I'll keep you informed. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you.